My father-in-law gave my husband an ultimatum: divorce me and marry my sister, or lose everything. Marcus chose his inheritance. 5 years later, I walked back into their lives as the CEO they desperately needed to save their failing empire. The look on Gregory's face when he realized who I was? Priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dining room at the Hartley Estate had always intimidated me. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting prismatic light across mahogany furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Tonight, though, sitting at that endless table with Marcus's family staring at me like I was an unwelcome stain on their pristine tablecloth, the intimidation had curdled into something else entirely. Dread, maybe, mixed with a growing sense that the life I'd built over 3 years of marriage was about to shatter. Gregory Hartley sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit pressed to knife-edge precision. He'd barely touched his wine, which meant this dinner wasn't about celebrating anything. My mother-in-law Diane picked at her salmon, her eyes darting between her husband and son with an expression I'd seen before but never understood until now. Fear. She was afraid of what was coming. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, but his palm was sweaty. My husband, usually so confident and self-assured, looked like a man facing execution. I'd asked him 3 times on the drive over what this dinner was really about. Each time, he deflected with vague reassurances that his father just wanted to discuss some family business. But family business didn't require my presence, and it certainly didn't warrant the funeral atmosphere hanging over this meal. Gregory set down his fork with deliberate precision, the soft click against fine china somehow ominous in the quiet room. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, folded it beside his plate, and finally looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "Claire, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your marriage to my son." My throat went dry. Beside me, Marcus's grip on my hand tightened painfully. I glanced at him, but he was staring at his untouched plate like it held the secrets of the universe. "Okay," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "What would you like to discuss?" "The Hartley family has certain expectations," Gregory began, his tone carrying that particular blend of condescension and authority that wealthy men mistake for wisdom. "Standards that have been maintained for 4 generations. When Marcus married you, we hoped you'd grow into understanding what it means to be part of this legacy." He paused, letting the weight of his disappointment settle over me like a heavy blanket. "Unfortunately, that hasn't happened." I felt my face flush hot, then cold. 3 years of biting my tongue at family gatherings, of enduring Diane's subtle criticisms about my middle-class background, of smiling through Gregory's lectures about proper social conduct, all of it came rushing back in a nauseating wave. "I've tried very hard to be a good wife to Marcus and a respectful daughter-in-law to your family." Gregory waved his hand dismissively, as if my efforts were gnats buzzing around his head. "Effort isn't the issue, Claire. Suitability is. You come from a different world, one that simply doesn't align with what this family represents. Marcus needs a partner who can navigate our social circles naturally, who understands the intricacies of maintaining our position in Portland society. Someone who was raised in this life, not someone trying to learn it." The words hit me like physical blows. I turned to Marcus, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his father that love mattered more than social standing, that our marriage was built on something more substantial than networking opportunities and country club memberships. But Marcus just sat there, his jaw clenched, staring at that damn plate. "What exactly are you saying, Gregory?" I forced the question out through numb lips. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the detached interest of a scientist examining a failed experiment. "I'm saying that this marriage was a mistake, one that needs to be corrected before it causes irreparable damage to Marcus's future and to the family's reputation. We've discussed this extensively, and we believe the best course of action is an amicable divorce." The room tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the dark wood. "You've discussed this? Who's we?" I looked at Marcus again, my voice rising. "Did you know about this? Were you part of these discussions about ending our marriage?" Marcus finally met my eyes, and what I saw there broke something fundamental inside me. Guilt, yes, but also resignation. He'd already made his choice, and it wasn't me. Claire, my father has valid concerns. The business is going through a transition, and there are considerations beyond just what you and I want. Considerations? I pulled my hand away from his like I'd been burned. We're talking about our marriage, Marcus. Our life together. What considerations could possibly matter more than that? The family's financial stability, Gregory interjected, his voice sharp and final. Marcus stands to inherit controlling interest in Hartley Industries when I retire, which will happen within the next 2 years. However, that inheritance comes with certain conditions, one of which is that he be married to someone who can properly represent the family's interests. You, Claire, are not that person. I felt tears burning behind my eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of this man who was dismantling my life with the casual efficiency of someone discarding outdated paperwork. So what, you're just cutting me loose? Throwing away 3 years because I don't fit your definition of proper? Gregory's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, maybe, or satisfaction at finally getting to the point he'd been building toward all evening. Actually, there's another factor we need to discuss. Your sister, Vanessa, has been spending quite a bit of time with our family over the past few months. The mention of my sister's name sent ice through my veins. Vanessa had started joining us for family dinners about 6 months ago, after she'd moved to Portland following a messy breakup in Seattle. I'd been happy to have her nearby, grateful that she was forming connections with Marcus's family. Now, hearing Gregory say her name in that particular tone, I understood with horrible clarity that I'd been blind to something obvious. Vanessa understands our world, Gregory continued, each word carefully chosen and devastating. She's charming, sophisticated, and most importantly, she knows how to conduct herself in the circles that matter to this family's business interests. Over the past months, it's become clear to all of us that she would have been a more appropriate match for Marcus from the beginning. The room spun. My sister. They wanted Marcus to divorce me for my sister. I looked at Diane, hoping for some sign of maternal sympathy, some indication that she found this plan as monstrous as I did. But she just looked away, sipping her wine with studied disinterest. She'd known. They'd all known. This whole nightmare had been orchestrated, probably for months, while I'd gone about my life completely oblivious to the conspiracy unfolding around me. You can't be serious, I whispered, my voice breaking despite my best efforts. You want him to marry Vanessa? My own sister? It makes practical sense, Gregory said, as if we were discussing a business merger rather than destroying my marriage and my family. Vanessa is already comfortable with our lifestyle, she's younger and more adaptable, and frankly, the optics are much better. A union between Marcus and Vanessa would strengthen both families in ways your marriage simply hasn't. I turned to Marcus one more time, desperate for him to finally show some backbone, some loyalty to the vows we'd made. Tell him no. Tell him this is insane. Tell him we're leaving and never coming back. But Marcus wouldn't look at me. His jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but no words came. In that silence, I understood everything. He'd already agreed to this. My husband had already chosen his inheritance over me. How long? My voice came out flat, emotionless, shock finally numbing the pain into something manageable. How long have you and Vanessa been planning this? Claire, it's not like that, Marcus finally spoke, but his words were weak, pathetic. Dad made it clear that my inheritance depends on making the right choices for the family. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't just walk away from everything my family has built. The company, the legacy, it's my responsibility. Your responsibility, I repeated slowly. And what about your responsibility to me? To the promises you made when we got married? Or did those vows come with fine print I didn't read? This is business, Claire, Gregory interjected, his patience clearly wearing thin. Personal feelings are secondary to practical realities. We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement, enough to set you up comfortably wherever you choose to go. All we ask is that you handle this divorce quietly and without unnecessary drama. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. A generous settlement? You think you can pay me off for destroying my marriage? For taking my husband and giving him to my own sister? Marcus stood too, reaching for my arm, but I jerked away from his touch. Claire, please, try to understand the position I'm in. If I don't do what my father says, I lose everything. The company, my trust fund, my place in this family. I'll have nothing. Then you'll have what I'm about to have, I said quietly, each word dropping like stones into still water. Nothing. Except I'll have my dignity, which is apparently something you sold a long time ago. I walked out of that dining room with my head high, even though my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Behind me, I heard Diane's voice, soft and uncertain, asking Gregory if this was really necessary, if they couldn't have handled it differently. His response was cold and final. It's done, Diane. She'll come to terms with it eventually. They always do. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive back to the apartment Marcus and I shared felt surreal. I kept expecting to wake up, to discover this had all been some stress-induced nightmare. But the city lights blurring past my windows were real, the ache in my chest was real, and the sound of my phone buzzing with a text message from Vanessa was devastatingly, horrifically real. I'm so sorry, Claire. I never meant for this to happen. Please call me so we can talk. I threw my phone into the passenger seat, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. She was sorry. My sister, who'd apparently been conducting some kind of audition for the role of Mrs. Marcus Hartley while I played the oblivious fool, was sorry. The betrayal felt impossibly huge, too big to process all at once. My husband and my sister. The two people I'd trusted most in the world besides my parents, who'd passed away years ago, leaving Vanessa as my only real family. Back at the apartment, I moved through rooms that suddenly felt foreign. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every photograph on the wall mocked me with false memories of happiness. Had Marcus ever really loved me? Or had I always been a placeholder, someone to keep his bed warm until a more suitable option presented itself? I pulled out my suitcase and started packing mechanically. Clothes, toiletries, the few personal items that were truly mine rather than gifts from the Hartley family that I now wanted nothing to do with. My laptop, the one I'd used to take online business courses while Marcus spent evenings at his father's office learning the family trade. My grandmother's jewelry box, the only inheritance I'd received from my own family. As I packed, my phone kept buzzing with messages. Marcus, begging me to come back so we could talk rationally. Vanessa, insisting she needed to explain. Even Diane, with a brief text suggesting I reconsider my reaction and think about what was best for everyone involved. What was best for everyone? The phrase made me want to scream. What about what was best for me? What about the life I'd invested 3 years in building? What about the future I'd imagined, the children I'd hoped to have, the decades of partnership I'd believed were ahead of us? I finished packing just as Marcus's key turned in the lock. He walked in looking haggard, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Claire, thank God you're here. We need to talk about this properly, without my father controlling the conversation. There's nothing to talk about, I said, zipping my suitcase closed. You made your choice at that dinner table. Actually, you made it months ago, apparently. I was just too stupid to see it. It's not that simple, he insisted, moving toward me. I love you, Claire. This is about survival, about not losing everything my family has worked for generations to build. I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. If you loved me, Marcus, you would have told your father to go to hell. You would have chosen me over money and social standing and whatever else he's holding over your head. But you didn't. You sat there silent while he dissected our marriage like it meant nothing. And what would we live on if I gave up my inheritance? He shot back, frustration finally breaking through his guilt. Your salary from that marketing firm? We'd be struggling, Claire. We'd lose this apartment, the lifestyle you've gotten used to, everything. I've been struggling my whole life, I said quietly. Growing up with parents who worked 3 jobs between them to keep us fed and housed. Putting myself through college on scholarships and student loans. Building a career from nothing because I didn't have family connections to open doors for me. You know what I haven't done, Marcus? I haven't betrayed the people I claimed to love because things got difficult. He flinched like I'd slapped him. This isn't fair. You're making me out to be some kind of villain when I'm just trying to do what's right for both of us in the long run. Both of us? I grabbed my suitcase handle. There is no both of us anymore. You and your father made sure of that. And Marcus? When you marry my sister, when you're living the life your family has planned out for you like some kind of puppet, I hope it's worth it. I hope every time you look at her, you remember what you gave up. I walked past him toward the door, but his voice stopped me one last time. Where will you go? I don't know, I answered honestly, my hand on the doorknob. But wherever it is, it'll be somewhere I'm valued for who I am, not dismissed for what I'm not. Goodbye, Marcus. The hotel room I checked into that night was generic and impersonal, but it was mine. No one could tell me I didn't belong there or that I wasn't good enough to occupy its space. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase still packed beside me, and finally let myself cry. Not quiet, dignified tears, but huge, gasping sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for my marriage, for my sister's betrayal, for the naive woman I'd been just hours ago who'd thought love and commitment meant something. When the tears finally stopped, leaving me hollow and exhausted, I pulled out my laptop. The cursor blinked on a blank document as I stared at it, trying to figure out what came next. I had some money saved, enough to get by for a few months if I was careful. My job at the marketing firm paid decently, though not enough to maintain the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to as Marcus's wife. But more than money or logistics, I needed a plan. I needed to figure out who Claire Donovan was when she wasn't defined by her marriage or her role in the Hartley family drama. My email pinged with a message from Nina Park, my best friend from college who'd moved to Austin 2 years ago. We'd stayed in touch through occasional video calls and text messages, but distance had made the friendship more distant than I liked. Her message was brief but perfectly timed. Hey stranger, I know it's been forever, but I was thinking about you today. How's life in Portland? Call me sometime when you have a chance. Miss your face. I stared at that message for a long time, then checked flights to Austin. There was one leaving tomorrow afternoon, reasonably priced, with seats available. Before I could second-guess myself, I booked it. Portland held nothing for me now except painful memories and people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. Austin represented possibility, a blank slate where nobody knew me as Marcus Hartley's unsuitable wife or Vanessa's inadequate older sister. In Austin, I could be whoever I decided to be. I called Nina, even though it was past midnight. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sleepy but warm. Claire? Is everything okay? Not even a little bit, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. But I just booked a flight to Austin tomorrow. Any chance you have a couch I could crash on for a while? There was a pause, then Nina's voice came back alert and concerned. Of course you can stay here. What happened? Are you okay? I'll tell you everything when I get there, I promised. I just need to get out of Portland and figure out what my life looks like now. That night, lying in that anonymous hotel bed, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, however long it took, I would build something that belonged entirely to me. Something no Gregory Hartley could take away because he deemed me unsuitable. Something that proved my worth wasn't determined by my ability to navigate country club politics or smile prettily at business dinners. I didn't know exactly what that something would be yet, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would find it. And when I did, when I'd built myself into someone powerful and successful and undeniably valuable, I'd make sure every single person who dismissed me understood exactly what they'd thrown away. Austin hit me like a wall of heat the moment I stepped off the plane. September in Texas meant temperatures still hovering in the 90s, a stark contrast to Portland's mild autumn. I stood outside the airport with my single suitcase, waiting for Nina, and felt sweat immediately start to bead on my forehead. Everything about this place was different. The sprawling landscape, the relentless sunshine, the way people moved with a casual confidence that Portland's reserved politeness never quite achieved. Different was exactly what I needed. Nina pulled up in a battered Honda Civic that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, oversized sunglasses covering half her face. She jumped out and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. When she finally released me, I saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh my God, Claire. I've been so worried since you called. Get in, we'll talk at my place where it's air-conditioned and I can properly hear about whatever disaster sent you fleeing across the country." Her apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a complex near the University of Texas campus. The furniture was mismatched, the kitchen barely bigger than a closet, and I loved it immediately. It felt real and lived in, nothing like the carefully curated perfection of the apartment I'd shared with Marcus. Nina poured us both iced tea and settled onto her worn couch, tucking her legs underneath her. "Okay, start from the beginning. What the hell happened?" So I told her everything. The dinner at the Hartley Estate, Gregory's cold dismissal of our marriage, Marcus's cowardice, Vanessa's betrayal. Nina listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to fury to something that looked like determination. When I finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd unloaded on her. "I want to say something that might sound harsh, but I need you to really hear me," she finally said. "That family did you a favor. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, and I know you're hurt and angry and probably questioning everything about yourself. But Claire, you're free. Free from people who never valued you, free from a marriage that was built on unequal ground from the start, free to become whoever you want to be without constantly trying to measure up to impossible standards." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I don't even know where to start. I have some savings, maybe enough for 3 months if I'm careful. I need to find a job, figure out where I'm going to live long term, deal with the divorce that's coming. It all feels so overwhelming. Then we break it down into manageable pieces, Nina said with the practical efficiency that had made her a successful project manager at a tech startup. "First, you're staying here as long as you need. My couch pulls out into a bed, and honestly, I could use the company. Second, we update your resume this week and start looking at job opportunities. Austin's tech scene is exploding right now. There are companies desperate for good people, and your marketing experience is valuable. Third, we find you a lawyer who will make sure you get a fair settlement from Marcus and his family. They want to buy you off? Fine, but they're going to pay properly for the privilege." Over the next few days, Nina became my anchor in the chaos. She dragged me to networking events where I met people who had no idea about my failed marriage or my inadequacy in the eyes of Portland society. She introduced me to her friend Lucia Santos, a sharp paralegal who connected me with a divorce attorney known for taking on wealthy families and winning. She even helped me draft a new resume that highlighted my skills rather than downplaying them the way I'd learned to do in Marcus's world. The divorce attorney, Patricia Chen, was a small woman with steel in her eyes and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when representing her clients. She listened to my story with clinical detachment, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled in a way that made me think of sharks circling prey. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "The Hartleys want this handled quietly and quickly. That desperation is leverage. They're worried about how this looks, about people asking questions about why Marcus is suddenly divorcing you to marry your sister. That kind of scandal is exactly what families like them try to avoid. So we're going to use their desire for discretion to get you everything you deserve. Spousal support, a significant cash settlement, and most importantly, an ironclad agreement that protects you from any further interference from them." "I don't want their money," I started to say, but Patricia held up her hand. "Yes, you do. Not because you need them to take care of you, but because accepting less than you're entitled to sends a message that they were right to treat you as disposable. Make them pay for that privilege, Claire. Use that money to build something they can never touch or diminish. Trust me, the best revenge isn't refusing their settlement. It's taking it and showing them exactly what you do with it. Her words resonated with something fierce growing inside me. She was right. Walking away with nothing might feel noble in the moment, but it would also let Gregory and Marcus off easy. They could tell themselves I'd been reasonable, that I'd understood the situation, that everything had worked out for the best. Taking a substantial settlement and then succeeding beyond their wildest expectations? That would haunt them in ways that noble poverty never could. The negotiations took 6 weeks. Marcus's lawyers initially offered what they clearly thought was a generous amount, enough to keep me comfortable for a few years if I was careful. Patricia laughed in their faces and countered with a number 3 times higher, citing emotional distress, loss of future earnings based on the connections I'd have made as Marcus's wife, and the reputational damage from such a public betrayal. They tried to lowball again. She threatened to take the entire sordid story public, complete with testimony about how Gregory had orchestrated the whole thing. Suddenly, they became much more agreeable. While the lawyers battled it out, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I took a marketing position at a mid-sized tech company that paid less than I'd hoped but offered room for growth. My boss, Thomas Brennan, was a gruff man in his late 50s who'd built 3 successful companies and sold them all before deciding he missed the day-to-day work. He took one look at my resume, asked me 3 pointed questions about campaign strategy, and hired me on the spot. "You're overqualified for this position," he told me bluntly during my first week. "I don't know what brought you to Austin or why you're willing to work for less than you're worth, and I don't need to know. What I do need is for you to stop second-guessing every decision you make. You have good instincts, Claire. Trust them." Working for Thomas was like getting a master's degree in business strategy compressed into daily interactions. He was demanding but fair, expecting excellence but providing the support and resources to achieve it. More importantly, he seemed to see potential in me that I'd stopped believing existed. When I hesitated to share ideas in meetings, he'd call on me directly. When I downplayed my contributions to successful campaigns, he'd publicly credit my work. Slowly, painfully, I started to remember who I'd been before Marcus and his family had convinced me I needed to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious. 3 months after arriving in Austin, the divorce was finalized. The settlement was more than I'd ever imagined having access to, enough to invest, to take risks, to build something substantial. Marcus had signed everything without argument, probably relieved to have the whole mess behind him so he could move forward with Vanessa. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they were already engaged, planning a spring wedding at the Hartley Estate. The same place where Gregory had told me I wasn't good enough for his family. The irony was almost funny in a bleak, painful way. I took half the settlement money and invested it conservatively, creating a safety net I'd never had before. The other half I used to make a gamble that either would pay off spectacularly or teach me an expensive lesson. Thomas had been talking about spinning off a division of the company into a separate entity focused specifically on helping tech startups with their marketing and brand strategy. It was a risky move, and he needed investors willing to take a chance on something unproven. I offered to invest a significant portion of my settlement in exchange for equity in the new venture. Thomas studied me across his desk, his expression unreadable. "This isn't guaranteed money, Claire. We could build something huge, or we could crash and burn. You'd be betting your financial security on a concept that doesn't even exist yet." "I know," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But I've learned that playing it safe doesn't guarantee anything either. I'd rather take a risk on something I believe in than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been braver." He smiled then, a genuine expression of respect that I'd learned to recognize and value. "All right then, partner. Let's build something worth building." That partnership changed everything. Summit Innovations launched 6 months later with Thomas as CEO and me as Chief Marketing Officer, a title that would have been unthinkable in my old life. We started small, taking on clients that larger firms ignored, startups with brilliant ideas but tiny budgets. I worked 100-hour weeks, learning everything I could about business development, client relations, strategic planning. Thomas pushed me constantly, refusing to accept anything less than my absolute best effort. Our first major break came when we landed a contract with a promising app startup that exploded into mainstream success 3 months after we revamped their entire brand strategy. Suddenly, other companies wanted what we were offering. Our client roster grew from 5 to 20 to 50. We hired staff, moved into a real office space in downtown Austin, started getting mentioned in industry publications. Thomas increasingly relied on me to handle high-level negotiations and strategy sessions, his confidence in my abilities unwavering even when my own faltered. One evening, almost 2 years after I'd arrived in Austin, Thomas called me into his office. We'd just closed a deal with a major client, and I'd led the entire pitch myself. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed me one, raising his glass in a toast. "To Claire Donovan," he said, "the best investment I ever made." "I'm pretty sure the company is your best investment," I said, but clinked my glass against his anyway. "The company is doing well because you're doing well," he corrected. "When you showed up in my office 2 years ago, you had all the skills and none of the confidence. Now you have both, and it's made all the difference. I'm proud of you, kid. Not just for what you've contributed to Summit Innovations, but for who you've become." His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on building the business, on proving something to myself and to everyone who dismissed me, that I hadn't stopped to recognize my own transformation. The woman sitting in this office, drinking expensive whiskey and discussing expansion strategies, bore little resemblance to the person who'd fled Portland with a single suitcase and a shattered heart. I'd learned to negotiate without apologizing for my requests. I'd stopped second-guessing my instincts. I'd built genuine friendships with people who valued me for my contributions rather than tolerating me out of obligation. That weekend, Nina took me out to celebrate the new contract. We went to a rooftop bar overlooking downtown Austin, the city lights spreading out below us like a carpet of stars. She raised her margarita glass with a grin. "To my brilliant, powerful, slightly intimidating best friend who has completely transformed her life in 2 years. I'm in awe of you, Claire." "I'm just doing what needs to be done," I said, but I couldn't help smiling. "No, you're doing what you were always capable of doing," Nina corrected. "You just needed to get away from people who made you feel small." "Have you talked to Vanessa at all?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't spoken to my sister since leaving Portland, ignoring her increasingly sporadic attempts to reach out. "No, and I don't plan to. What would I even say?" Nina shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe nothing. Or maybe eventually you tell her that she did you the biggest favor of your life by showing you who she really was. But that's years down the road, if ever. You don't owe her forgiveness or closure or anything else." Her words settled something in me. I'd spent so much energy being angry at Vanessa, at Marcus, at Gregory, and the entire Hartley family, that I'd almost missed the point. Their betrayal had hurt, devastatingly so, but it had also freed me from a life that would have slowly suffocated who I really was. I'd never have taken the risks that led to Summit Innovations if I'd stayed in Portland as Marcus's wife. I'd never have discovered my capacity for leadership or my talent for strategy if I'd remained in a world that constantly told me to be less ambitious, less outspoken, less everything. As Summit Innovations continued to grow, I found myself thinking less about Portland and more about the future I was building. We opened a second office in San Francisco, hired a talented team of strategists and creatives, started being courted by venture capital firms interested in helping us scale even faster. Thomas began talking about retirement, about transitioning leadership to someone who could take the company into its next phase. The someone he had in mind was obvious, though it took him months to finally say it out loud. We were reviewing quarterly projections when he set down his pen and looked at me with that serious expression I'd learned meant he was about to say something important. "I'm 62 years old, Claire. I've built this company into something I'm proud of, but I'm tired. My wife wants to travel while we're still young enough to enjoy it, and honestly, I'm ready to step back. I think it's time for you to take over as CEO." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. "Thomas, I'm 37 years old. We have board members with decades more experience than me. Investors who expect seasoned leadership. Are you sure this is the right move?" "I've never been more sure of anything," he said firmly. You know this company inside and out. You've built half our client relationships personally. The staff respects you, our clients trust you, and most importantly, you have the vision to take Summit Innovations beyond what I ever imagined it could be. Age is irrelevant, Claire. Capability is what matters, and you're more capable than anyone else I could name. The transition took 6 months of careful planning and preparation. Thomas made sure I was comfortable with every aspect of running the company, introduced me to key contacts in the industry, coached me through my first interactions with the board of directors as CEO rather than CMO. When the official announcement went out, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Industry publications ran features about my unconventional path to leadership. Clients reached out to express their enthusiasm about the company's direction. The staff threw a party in the office, and I stood there looking at the faces of people who'd chosen to work for me, feeling a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. That night, alone in my downtown apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, I allowed myself to reflect on how far I'd come. 5 years ago, I'd been a woman defined by her relationships, her value determined by how well she fit into other people's expectations. I'd let Marcus's family convince me that my background made me lesser, that my ambitions were inappropriate, that my worth was conditional on my ability to make myself smaller. Now I was the CEO of a thriving company with offices in 2 cities and a client roster that included some of the most innovative startups in the country. I'd built this through my own efforts, my own decisions, my own refusal to accept that other people's limitations applied to me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Portland number. It had been years since anyone from my old life had tried to contact me. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was from Diane Hartley, Marcus's mother. Claire, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out because Gregory is looking for consulting firms that specialize in business restructuring and brand rehabilitation. Hartley Industries has been struggling, and we need outside expertise. Your company came highly recommended by several people in our network. Would you be willing to discuss a potential engagement? I read the message 3 times, a slow smile spreading across my face. Hartley Industries was struggling and they wanted Summit Innovations to help save them. They wanted me to help save them, though Diane probably didn't realize yet that I was the CEO she'd be dealing with. The irony was so perfect it almost didn't seem real. Gregory Hartley, who'd told me I wasn't sophisticated enough to represent his family's interests, who'd orchestrated my divorce because I lacked the proper social standing, now needed my expertise to rescue his failing empire. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down to compose my response, taking my time with each word. Every sentence needed to be professional, courteous, and absolutely perfect. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about demonstrating value that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. It was about walking back into a world that had rejected me and showing them exactly what they'd thrown away. It was about claiming power that belonged to me, had always belonged to me, and using it on my own terms. I scheduled the preliminary call with Diane for the following week, giving myself time to research Hartley Industries' current situation thoroughly. What I discovered confirmed that their problems ran deeper than simple market fluctuations. The company had lost 3 major accounts in the past 18 months. Their quarterly earnings had dropped consistently for 2 years, and industry analysts were openly questioning whether the family business could survive another poor fiscal year. Gregory's carefully maintained empire was crumbling, and from what I could piece together from industry gossip and public filings, much of the decline coincided with key personnel departures and management decisions that prioritized family loyalty over competence. The preliminary call was audio only, which meant Diane still didn't know she was speaking with me. I'd registered the meeting under Summit Innovations without listing specific team members who'd be involved. Her voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered, as she outlined their situation with careful corporate language that couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. We're looking for a firm that can assess our operational structure and help us identify areas for improvement, she explained, her words chosen with obvious care. Hartley Industries has been a cornerstone of Portland's business community for 70 years. And we're committed to ensuring that legacy continues for future generations. However, we recognize that we may need outside perspective to navigate current market challenges. I took notes while she spoke, keeping my voice professionally neutral. What specific outcomes are you hoping to achieve through this engagement? Are we discussing minor operational adjustments, or are you open to more substantial organizational restructuring? There was a pause, then Diane's voice came back smaller and more honest. We need someone who can tell us the truth about what's broken and how to fix it, even if that truth is difficult to hear. Gregory is resistant to admitting that his approach may need updating, but our board has made it clear that significant changes are necessary. We need an objective assessment from someone who understands both the business landscape and the complexities of family-operated companies. I understand completely, I said, making a note about Gregory's resistance to change. Summit Innovations has extensive experience helping established companies adapt to evolving markets while preserving core values. I'd like to propose an initial consultation where we can review your situation in detail and develop a preliminary assessment. Would you and your leadership team be available for an in-person meeting? Diane agreed readily, suggesting dates 2 weeks out. As we finalized the logistics, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't about anger anymore, or even about proving them wrong. It was about demonstrating what I'd become, about walking into that world as someone they needed rather than someone they could dismiss. The scared, eager to please woman who'd sat at their dinner table accepting insults disguised as concern was gone. In her place was someone who'd built her own empire through intelligence, determination, and a refusal to accept other people's limitations as her own. I assembled a team for the Portland trip carefully. Lucia Santos, who'd risen from junior analyst to senior strategist in the 3 years since joining Summit Innovations, would handle the operational assessment. Marcus Webb, our financial expert with a talent for identifying inefficiencies, would review their fiscal structures. And I would lead the engagement personally, presenting our findings and recommendations to the Hartley family and their board of directors. Thomas called me the night before we were scheduled to fly out, his voice warm with amusement. I heard through the grapevine that you're taking on Hartley Industries. That's the family from your previous life, isn't it? The ones who thought you weren't good enough? The very same, I confirmed, reviewing my presentation notes one final time. Apparently their business acumen wasn't as sophisticated as their social standards. Now they need help from the company they indirectly helped me build. He laughed, a rich sound that conveyed both satisfaction and approval. That's poetic justice if I've ever heard it. Are you ready for this, Claire? Walking back into that environment could bring up difficult memories. I'm not the same person who left Portland, I said, and was surprised to realize how completely I believed it. They're not walking into their world on their terms anymore. They're walking into mine. That changes everything. The flight to Portland felt surreal. I'd sworn I'd never return to this city, yet here I was, not as a refugee fleeing disaster but as a successful executive coming to save the people who destroyed my marriage. Nina had offered to come along for moral support, but I'd declined. This was something I needed to do alone, or at least with my professional team rather than personal friends. This wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about business, and I needed to approach it with the clear-headed professionalism that had built Summit Innovations into what it was today. We checked into a hotel downtown, and I spent the evening preparing for the next day's meeting. Lucia knocked on my door around 8 with a bottle of wine and a knowing look. You've reviewed those files 17 times, she said, settling into the chair by the window. At some point you have to trust that you know the material and that you're ready for whatever happens tomorrow. I poured us both a glass and sat on the edge of the bed. What if seeing them again makes me remember how small they made me feel? What if I walk into that building and suddenly I'm that woman again, desperate for approval and willing to accept scraps? Lucia studied me over the rim of her glass, her dark eyes serious. That woman got you through an impossible situation with grace. She survived a betrayal that would have broken a lot of people. But she's not who you are anymore, Claire. You're the CEO who rebuilt my confidence after a toxic previous job. You're the leader who took a chance on Marcus when other firms wouldn't hire him because of his past mistakes. You're the person who built a company culture where people feel valued and challenged in equal measure. That's who walks into Hartley Industries tomorrow, not some scared version of yourself from 5 years ago. Her words helped more than she probably realized. I'd been so focused on how the Hartleys might react to seeing me that I'd almost forgotten I wasn't going there seeking anything from them. They needed me, my expertise, my company's resources. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and I needed to remember that. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with deliberate care. A charcoal gray suit that projected authority without arrogance, minimal jewelry, professional but not severe. I looked at myself in the hotel mirror and saw someone confident, capable, and completely in control. This was who I'd become. The Hartleys would have to accept that or find someone else to save their failing company. Hartley Industries occupied a historic building in downtown Portland, all red brick and tall windows that spoke to old money and established power. I'd been here before, of course, back when I was Marcus's wife and occasional visitor to his family business. But I'd always entered through the side door, always been made to feel like a guest rather than someone who belonged in these halls of commerce and legacy. Today, I walked through the front entrance with Lucia and Marcus flanking me, our heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floors. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning, welcome to Hartley Industries. How may I help you?" "Claire Donovan from Summit Innovations," I said clearly. "We have a 10 o'clock meeting with Mrs. Hartley and the executive team." She checked her computer, nodded, and picked up the phone. "I'll let them know you've arrived. Please have a seat in our reception area, and someone will be down shortly to escort you to the conference room." We settled into the plush chairs, and I used the wait time to center myself. This was business. Whatever personal history existed between myself and this family was irrelevant to the professional engagement we were here to conduct. I needed to assess their operational problems objectively, provide honest recommendations, and leave them better positioned for future success. That I would also be demonstrating my value in a way they could no longer dismiss was simply a satisfying side effect. The elevator doors opened and a young man in a crisp suit emerged, scanning the reception area until his eyes landed on our group. "Summit Innovations?" He approached with an extended hand. "I'm Jeremy Walsh, executive assistant to Mrs. Hartley. Thank you for coming all this way. If you'll follow me, I'll take you up to the executive conference room." We rode the elevator to the top floor in silence. Jeremy made polite small talk about our flight and accommodations, clearly having no idea who I was or what my connection to this family might be. As far as he knew, we were just another consulting firm brought in to solve problems above his pay grade. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area I'd never seen during my previous life adjacent to this company. This was the executive floor, where real decisions were made and power was concentrated. I'd never been invited up here when I was Marcus's wife, had never been deemed important enough to see where the actual business of running Hartley Industries occurred. The conference room was exactly what I expected. Long mahogany table, leather chairs, walls lined with photographs documenting the company's 70-year history. Gregory's father and grandfather stared down from frames that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, their expressions stern and judgmental. I wondered what they'd think of their descendant needing rescue from the outside consultant he'd once deemed unworthy of the family name. Jeremy gestured to seats along one side of the table. "Please make yourselves comfortable. Mrs. Hartley and the team will be in shortly. Can I get anyone coffee or water?" We declined politely, and he left us alone in the imposing space. Lucia pulled out her tablet and began reviewing notes while Marcus set up his laptop for the presentation. I stood by the windows, looking out over the Portland skyline. Somewhere out there was the apartment I'd shared with Marcus, the restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries, the parks where I'd walked alone trying to understand why I never felt quite good enough. All of that felt distant now, like memories from someone else's life. The conference room door opened and Diane Hartley entered, followed by 3 men I didn't recognize who were presumably board members or senior executives. Diane looked older than I remembered, her blonde hair now more silver than gold, her face showing lines that 5 years and obvious stress had etched there. She was talking to one of the men, some comment about quarterly projections, when her eyes landed on me. I watched recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her face went pale, her mouth opened slightly, and for a long moment she simply stared. "Claire?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Is that you?" Hello, Diane, I said calmly, moving away from the window to stand at my place at the table. Thank you for inviting Summit Innovations to consult on your operational challenges. I'm looking forward to discussing how we can help Hartley Industries navigate this difficult period. One of the men looked between us, confusion evident on his face. I'm sorry, do you two know each other? Mrs. Hartley and I have a previous connection, I said smoothly, my tone making it clear I had no intention of elaborating. However, I can assure you that won't impact the objectivity of our assessment. Summit Innovations maintains the highest professional standards regardless of any personal history. Diane had recovered some of her composure, though her hand shook slightly as she set her leather portfolio on the table. Of course, yes, I apologize for my surprise. I wasn't aware that you were with Summit Innovations, Claire. The last I heard, you were working in marketing for a smaller firm. I founded Summit Innovations 4 years ago and took over as CEO 18 months ago, I explained, keeping my voice professionally pleasant. We've built a strong reputation for helping established companies restructure and adapt to changing market conditions. I've personally led over 30 successful engagements, including several with family-operated businesses facing similar challenges to what you've described. She sank into her chair slowly, still looking stunned. I see. Well, that's certainly impressive. I had no idea you'd achieved such success. Before I could respond, the conference room door opened again and Gregory Hartley walked in, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his expression harried in a way I'd never seen during my marriage to his son. He was reading something on his phone and didn't look up immediately. Diane, I apologize for being late. The accountants needed to review the third quarter numbers again, and they're even worse than we thought. He finally glanced up, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on me. We need to discuss whether we can afford to hire outside consultants at all given our current financial situation. The moment he recognized me was almost comical. His face went through a rapid series of expressions, shock, confusion, something that might have been embarrassment before settling on a carefully controlled neutrality that didn't quite reach his eyes. He stood frozen in the doorway for several long seconds before finally entering the room and closing the door behind him. Claire, he said, his voice strained. This is unexpected. Mr. Hartley, I replied with professional courtesy. Thank you for making time for this meeting. I understand you have significant concerns about Hartley Industries' current trajectory. Why don't we begin by reviewing the operational assessment my team has prepared, and then we can discuss whether our services are a good fit for your needs. Gregory moved to his seat at the head of the table, his movements stiff and uncomfortable. He looked older too, I realized. The confident authority he'd wielded so effortlessly 5 years ago had been worn down by stress and failing business performance. He looked like a man watching his legacy crumble and having no idea how to stop it. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy before I reminded myself why I was here. This was business, and whatever personal history existed between us couldn't be allowed to compromise the professional engagement we were about to undertake. Before we begin, Gregory said, his tone attempting authority but landing somewhere closer to defensive, I think we need to address the obvious conflict of interest here. Given your personal history with this family, how can we trust that your assessment will be objective rather than influenced by past grievances? I met his eyes steadily, my voice calm and absolutely professional. Mr. Hartley, Summit Innovations has built its reputation on delivering honest, actionable insights regardless of personal relationships. Every recommendation we make will be based on data, industry best practices, and proven strategies for operational improvement. If at any point you feel our assessment is compromised by bias rather than grounded in professional expertise, you're welcome to seek a second opinion. However, I can assure you that my team and I are here to help Hartley Industries succeed, not to settle old scores. One of the other men at the table cleared his throat. If I may, I'm Robert Chen, chairman of the board. Mrs. Hartley brought your firm to our attention based on your exceptional work with Harrison Tech last year. Their turnaround was remarkable, and several people in my network specifically praised your leadership during that engagement. I'd like to hear your assessment regardless of any personal complications. We're in a difficult position, and we need honest insights from people who know what they're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chen, I said, appreciating his directness. Then let's begin. Lucia, if you'd pull up the operational overview? For the next 90 minutes, we walked the Hartley team through our preliminary assessment. Lucia presented findings on operational inefficiencies, redundant processes that were costing them time and money, outdated systems that their competitors had modernized years ago. Marcus reviewed their financial structures, pointing out areas where costs could be reduced without compromising quality, revenue streams they were underutilizing, investment decisions that had failed to generate expected returns. And then it was my turn to present the most critical findings, the ones that dealt with leadership and organizational culture. I'd spent hours preparing this section, knowing it would be the most difficult for Gregory to hear but also the most essential for the company's survival. I pulled up a slide showing employee turnover rates over the past 5 years, the numbers telling a stark story of talented people leaving at an alarming rate. One of the most significant challenges facing Hartley Industries is retention of key personnel, I began, my tone professional but firm. Over the past 5 years, you've lost 42% of your senior management team, 60% of your mid-level managers, and have an overall employee turnover rate that's nearly double the industry average. Exit interviews, where they were conducted, consistently cited concerns about advancement opportunities being tied to family connections rather than merit, lack of transparency in decision-making processes, and resistance to new ideas from leadership. Gregory's face had gone red, but he remained silent. Diane looked uncomfortable, her eyes fixed on the table. Robert Chen and the other board members were leaning forward, clearly engaged with what I was presenting. This was information they needed to hear, even if it was uncomfortable. I advanced to the next slide, showing client retention data. Your client relationships tell a similar story. Of the 8 major accounts you've lost in the past 3 years, 6 cited concerns about communication breakdowns, missed deadlines, and lack of responsiveness from account management. In follow-up conversations my team conducted with former clients, a pattern emerged of frustration with leadership that seemed disconnected from day-to-day operations and unwilling to adapt to changing client needs. That's not entirely fair, Gregory interjected, his voice tight. We've faced increased competition and market changes that have impacted many companies in our sector. You're absolutely right, I agreed, clicking to the next slide. Market conditions have changed significantly. However, your competitors operating in the same environment have maintained or grown their client bases. The difference isn't market conditions. It's adaptability. Companies that have thrived in this landscape are those that empowered talented employees regardless of family connections, embraced new technologies and methodologies, and prioritized client needs over internal politics. The room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Gregory looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Diane was still staring at the table, her expression unreadable. The board members were taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions that suggested they'd been concerned about these exact issues for some time. I spent the final 30 minutes outlining our recommendations. Comprehensive restructuring that created clear advancement paths based on performance rather than family status. Investment in updated systems and technologies. Leadership training focused on adaptive management and transparent communication. Rebuilding client relationships through dedicated account teams with actual authority to make decisions. Every suggestion was backed by data, by industry research, by case studies from similar companies that had successfully navigated comparable challenges. When I finished, the room sat in heavy silence. Robert Chen was the first to speak, his voice thoughtful. This is the most comprehensive and honest assessment we've received. I appreciate your candor, Ms. Donovan, even though I'm sure some of these findings are difficult to hear. He glanced at Gregory, then back to me. If we were to move forward with implementing these recommendations, what kind of engagement timeline are we looking at? Full implementation would take 12 to 18 months, I said, pulling up our proposed engagement structure. We'd begin with immediate priority items, things that can show measurable improvement within the first quarter. That builds momentum and demonstrates value while we work on longer-term structural changes. My team would work closely with your staff throughout the process, providing training, support, and accountability to ensure lasting change rather than temporary fixes. Gregory finally found his voice, though it lacked his usual commanding tone. This seems like a massive undertaking. The cost alone must be substantial. It is substantial, I confirmed. However, the cost of not addressing these issues is substantially higher. Based on your current trajectory, Hartley Industries will be insolvent within 18 months. Our engagement fee is significant, but it's an investment in survival and future growth rather than an expense. The board members exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Robert Chen nodded slowly. We'll need to discuss this internally, obviously. But speaking personally, I'm convinced this is exactly what we need. The question is whether we're brave enough to actually implement changes that will be uncomfortable but necessary. Diane spoke up for the first time in almost an hour, her voice soft but clear. May I ask you something, Claire? Off the record, as someone who used to know this family well. Do you think we can recover from this? Or have we damaged things beyond repair? I considered the question carefully, aware that everyone in the room was watching me, waiting to see if personal feelings would color my professional judgment. Honestly, Mrs. Hartley, I think the damage is significant but not irreparable. You have strong brand recognition, loyal clients who haven't left yet, and a legacy worth preserving. But recovery requires more than just operational changes. It requires a fundamental shift in how leadership thinks about power, about value, and about what actually makes a company successful in the modern business environment. Whether you can make that shift is something only you can answer. The meeting adjourned with an agreement that the board would review our proposal and provide a decision within 1 week. As everyone gathered their materials and began filing out, Gregory remained seated at the head of the table, his posture suggesting exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Diane hesitated near the door, glancing between her husband and me before finally leaving with the board members. Within moments, only Gregory and I remained in the conference room, the silence stretching uncomfortably between us. I began packing my laptop, preparing to leave, when his voice stopped me. That was quite a presentation. Very thorough. Very professional. His tone was difficult to read, somewhere between grudging respect and residual defensiveness. Thank you, I said simply, continuing to organize my materials. My team put in extensive research to ensure our assessment was accurate and actionable. He stood slowly, moving to the windows where I'd stood earlier, looking out over the city he'd dominated for decades. I suppose you're feeling rather vindicated right now. The woman I dismissed as unsuitable coming back to tell me everything I've done wrong. There's a certain poetic justice to it. I closed my laptop case and turned to face him fully. Mr. Hartley, I'm not here for vindication or justice. I'm here because your wife reached out to my company requesting professional assistance, and that's what we provided. Whatever happened 5 years ago is irrelevant to the business challenges you're facing now. Is it though? He turned from the window, his expression more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. I made a decision based on what I thought was best for my family's future. I prioritized legacy and tradition over individual feelings. Now that tradition is failing, and I can't help but wonder if all my certainty about what mattered was fundamentally misguided. The admission surprised me. This was not the imperious man who'd orchestrated my divorce with cold efficiency, who'd spoken about me as if I were a business problem to be solved rather than a person with inherent worth. This was someone confronting the consequences of his choices and finding them far more costly than anticipated. What happened to your marriage to Marcus wasn't about business decisions or legacy preservation, I said quietly. It was about respect and value. You looked at me and saw someone whose background didn't align with your vision of what the Hartley name should represent. You never considered that my different perspective might actually strengthen rather than weaken your family. And now you're losing your company for many of the same reasons, because you've consistently chosen image over substance, connections over competence. He flinched slightly but didn't argue. You've certainly proven that my assessment of you was wrong. Summit Innovations is impressive, and from what I've heard in the industry, much of that success is directly attributable to your leadership. I underestimated you badly. Yes, you did, I agreed. But more importantly, you underestimated what creates actual value in business and in life. It's not breeding or social polish or maintaining appearances. It's intelligence, dedication, adaptability, and the willingness to recognize talent regardless of where it comes from. Those are the principles that built Summit Innovations, and they're the same principles Hartley Industries needs to embrace if it's going to survive. Gregory returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. If we do move forward with your recommendations, if I implement these changes you're suggesting, it means admitting that the way I've run this company for 30 years was wrong. That's a bitter pill to swallow. The alternative is watching everything your father and grandfather built disappear entirely, I pointed out. Pride is expensive, Mr. Hartley. Sometimes the cost is higher than anyone can afford to pay. You have to decide whether your ego is worth more than your legacy. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the polished table. When Diane told me Summit Innovations was interested in working with us, I was relieved. I'd heard excellent things about your company's track record. Then when I walked in and saw you standing there, my first instinct was to call the whole thing off. The humiliation of needing help from someone I'd dismissed so thoroughly felt unbearable. But you didn't call it off, I observed. No, he said slowly. Because Robert was right. This is the most honest assessment we've received, and honesty is something I've been avoiding for far too long. It's easier to blame market conditions and bad luck than to acknowledge that my own rigidity has driven away talented people and loyal clients. Easier, but ultimately destructive. I picked up my laptop case, preparing to leave but wanting to end this conversation with something approaching closure. For what it's worth, Mr. Hartley, I hope you do implement our recommendations. Not because I need you to validate my worth, I know my value now regardless of your opinion. But because Hartley Industries employs over 300 people who deserve leadership that prioritizes the company's health over personal pride. They deserve better than watching their jobs disappear because change felt too uncomfortable. As I reached the door, his voice stopped me one more time. Claire, does Marcus know you're here? That you're the one leading this engagement? The question caught me off guard. I haven't spoken to your son in 5 years, Mr. Hartley. I have no idea what he knows or doesn't know about my life, and frankly, it's not relevant to my work here. He's not happy, Gregory said quietly. The marriage to Vanessa, it's not what any of us expected. She's not you, and I think he realizes that now, though he'd never admit it. Seeing you like this, successful and confident and clearly thriving without him, it would be difficult for him. Then perhaps he shouldn't have chosen his inheritance over his marriage, I said without anger. We all make choices, Mr. Hartley. We all have to live with the consequences. Marcus made his choice 5 years ago, and I've built an excellent life from the pieces that choice left behind. I don't wish him unhappiness, but I also don't carry any responsibility for whatever regrets he might have now. I left him sitting alone in that conference room, and as the elevator descended, I felt a strange sense of completion. The confrontation I hadn't known I needed had happened naturally, without planning or rehearsal. I'd said what needed saying without cruelty or excessive emotion, and more importantly, I'd meant every word. The Hartleys no longer had power over my sense of self-worth. They were simply people who needed professional help that I was qualified to provide, nothing more and nothing less. Lucia and Marcus were waiting in the hotel lobby when I returned, both looking concerned. Lucia stood as I approached. How did it go after we left? We saw Gregory stay behind when everyone else departed. It was fine, I assured them, sinking into one of the leather chairs. He wanted to acknowledge that he'd underestimated me, and I wanted to make clear that their personal opinions don't impact my professional judgment. It was actually a conversation that needed to happen. Now we wait to see if pride or practicality wins out when they make their decision. Marcus Webb cleared his throat, his expression unusually serious. Claire, I need to say something. Watching you in that conference room today, presenting findings that essentially indicted everything that family stands for, I was in awe. Not just of your professional skills, though those were exceptional. But of your composure, your refusal to let old wounds compromise your integrity. You treated them fairly even though they treated you terribly, and that takes real strength. His words touched me more than I expected. Marcus had his own history of being judged and dismissed, had rebuilt his career after mistakes that other firms couldn't see past. He understood something of what this engagement meant beyond just business. Thank you, I said simply. That means a lot coming from you. The week that followed felt interminably long. We returned to Austin, but my attention kept drifting back to Portland, wondering what discussions were happening in Hartley Industries boardrooms, whether Gregory could actually humble himself enough to accept help from someone he'd once deemed unworthy. Robert Chen called midweek with questions about implementation timelines and cost structures, which I took as a positive sign that serious consideration was being given to our proposal. Nina invited me over for dinner that Friday, her small house filled with the smell of her grandmother's Korean recipes and the comfortable chaos of her life with her partner Jordan. As we sat around their kitchen table, Jordan refilling wine glasses while Nina served up bulgogi and banchan, I found myself relaxing in a way I couldn't in my own space. "So, are you going to tell us about Portland, or are we going to have to drag it out of you?" Nina asked, loading up my plate with more food than any human could reasonably eat. "You've been distracted all week, which means something significant happened." I walked into that conference room as the CEO of the company they're desperately hoping will save their business, I said, taking a sip of wine. Gregory and Diane had no idea I'd be the one presenting. The looks on their faces when they recognized me were worth the entire trip. Jordan laughed, a warm sound that always made me smile. I bet they nearly swallowed their tongues. "What did they say?" "Not much at first, mostly just professional acknowledgement of our history. But Gregory stayed after the meeting ended, and we had a real conversation. He admitted he'd underestimated me, that his entire approach to running the company was flawed. It wasn't the groveling apology I might have fantasized about years ago, but it was honest, and that mattered more." Nina studied me across the table, her expression thoughtful. "How did it feel, being back in that world but on completely different terms?" "Liberating," I said after considering the question. 5 years ago, I left Portland feeling like a failure, like everything I'd tried to build had been destroyed by people who'd never valued me in the first place. Walking back in as someone they needed, presenting findings they couldn't dismiss, it closed a circle I didn't even realize was still open. I don't need their validation anymore, but it was satisfying to demonstrate that their judgment of me was so fundamentally wrong. The call from Robert Chen came Monday morning just as I was reviewing quarterly projections for our other clients. His voice carried a mixture of relief and determination that told me what his answer was before he spoke the words. "Ms. Donovan, the board met over the weekend for an extensive discussion about your proposal. I'm pleased to tell you that we voted unanimously to move forward with Summit Innovations. Gregory abstained from the vote due to conflict of interest, but he's committed to implementing whatever changes we determine are necessary." I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the financial value of landing such a significant client. This was about validation earned through competence rather than given through pity or obligation. "That's excellent news, Mr. Chen. My team can begin the initial phase within 2 weeks. I'll have our contracts department send over the engagement agreement for your review. There's one more thing," he continued, his tone becoming more personal. "I want you to know that this decision wasn't easy for everyone involved. There were concerns about whether your personal history with the family would create complications. But I argued, and the board agreed, that your professionalism during our initial meeting demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and integrity Hartley Industries needs to learn from. You treated us fairly when you had every reason not to, and that spoke volumes about your character." After we concluded the call, I sat for a moment letting the reality settle over me. This was happening. I was going back to Portland, not as Marcus Hartley's unsuitable ex-wife, but as the CEO hired to rescue his family's failing empire. The symmetry was almost too perfect, the universe providing a form of justice I'd stopped expecting. Thomas called that afternoon, having heard through industry channels that we'd landed the Hartley account. His voice was warm with pride and amusement. "Congratulations on the new client. I heard it's a significant engagement with some interesting personal dimensions." "You could say that," I agreed, unable to keep the smile out of my voice. The family that once told me I wasn't sophisticated enough to represent their interests is now paying substantial fees for the privilege of my expertise. Life has a sense of irony I'm learning to appreciate. "Just remember why you're really there," he cautioned gently. "You're not there to prove anything to people whose opinions don't matter anymore. You're there to do excellent work that helps a struggling company and protects the jobs of people who had nothing to do with past hurts. Keep that focus, and everything else will take care of itself." His words grounded me in a way I needed. This engagement was about more than personal vindication. It was about demonstrating the principles that had built Summit Innovations into what it was, principles of competence over connections, merit over nepotism, adaptability over rigid tradition. If I could help Hartley Industries embrace those principles, I'd be doing meaningful work regardless of whatever satisfaction I derived from the personal dimensions. The 2 weeks before we officially began the engagement passed quickly, filled with detailed planning sessions, team preparation, and coordination with Hartley Industries staff. I'd be spending 3 weeks in Portland each month for the foreseeable future, which meant finding temporary housing and establishing routines that would let me maintain leadership of Summit Innovations while being physically present for the Hartley work. Lucia would be my second in command on site, with Marcus Webb traveling in for specific financial reviews. The night before my first extended Portland trip, Nina came over with takeout and moral support. She found me in my apartment surrounded by suitcases, presentation materials, and 3 different outfits I couldn't decide between. "You're overthinking this," she said, pushing aside a stack of folders to make room on my couch. "You've led dozens of engagements. This is just another client. This is the family that destroyed my marriage and told me I wasn't good enough for their world," I countered, holding up 2 blazers for her opinion. "Now I'm going back to spend weeks at a time in their company headquarters, working directly with the man who orchestrated that destruction. It's not exactly just another client." She pointed to the navy blazer, then fixed me with a serious look. "Exactly. Which is why you need to remember that you're not going there as wounded Claire who needs their approval. You're going as CEO Claire who has skills they desperately need. You're not seeking anything from them except the opportunity to do excellent work and get paid well for it. Everything else is noise." "What if I see Marcus?" The question I'd been avoiding asking finally came out. "He works in that building. At some point we're going to cross paths, and I have no idea what I'll say or how I'll feel." "You'll feel whatever you feel in that moment, and then you'll proceed professionally because that's who you are now," Nina said firmly. "He doesn't get to make you uncertain or uncomfortable in your own professional space. If seeing him is awkward, that's his problem to manage, not yours. You're there to work, and he's just another employee of a client company." Her confidence bolstered mine. She was right, of course. Whatever emotional residue remained from my failed marriage couldn't be allowed to compromise my professional performance. I'd faced Gregory, survived that confrontation with my dignity intact. Seeing Marcus would be uncomfortable but manageable, just another challenge to navigate with the same composure I developed over 5 years of building Summit Innovations. The flight to Portland the next morning felt different from the preliminary trip 2 weeks earlier. This time I wasn't flying in for a single meeting but for an extended engagement that would test my ability to maintain professional distance while working in close proximity to people who represented my most painful memories. Lucia met me at baggage claim, already having arrived on an earlier flight to begin setting up our temporary office space within the Hartley Industries building. "They've given us a conference room on the 3rd floor to use as our base of operations," she reported as we drove toward downtown. "It's small but private, with good technology infrastructure." Robert Chen made it clear to the staff that we're to have full cooperation and access to whatever information we need. Some people seem genuinely excited about the changes we're bringing, others are clearly skeptical. "Skepticism is normal," I said, watching familiar Portland streets pass by the window. "Change is uncomfortable, especially in a company that's operated the same way for decades. Our job is to demonstrate value quickly enough that skepticism turns into buy-in before resistance can calcify into active obstruction." "There's one more thing you should know," Lucia said carefully. "Marcus Hartley reached out to Robert Chen yesterday asking about our engagement timeline and which team members would be on site. Chen said it was framed as operational curiosity, but it sounded more like Marcus trying to figure out if you'd be here regularly." Of course he was. I kept my voice neutral despite the anxiety that information triggered. "Did Chen tell him?" "He confirmed that you'd be leading the engagement personally and would be in Portland several weeks each month." Apparently Marcus went very quiet after that, just thanked him for the information and ended the call. "So he knows," I said quietly. "Which means the next time we see each other, there won't be the element of surprise to hide behind. We'll both be prepared, both aware, and I'll have to face whatever that encounter brings." We spent that first day establishing our presence in the Hartley Industries building, meeting with department heads, reviewing operational procedures, beginning the detailed work of understanding how the company functioned day to day. People were polite but cautious, clearly uncertain about these outside consultants who'd been brought in to evaluate and potentially restructure their workplace. I made a point of listening more than talking in those initial meetings, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their perspectives rather than coming in with predetermined solutions. It was late afternoon, nearly 6 o'clock, when I finally returned to our temporary office to review notes from the day's meetings. Lucia had left an hour earlier to check into our hotel and rest before dinner. I was alone, deeply focused on my laptop, when I heard the office door open. I looked up, expecting to see a custodial staff member, and found myself staring directly at Marcus Hartley for the first time in 5 years. He stood in the doorway, neither entering nor leaving, just frozen in that liminal space. 5 years had changed him in subtle ways. A few gray hairs at his temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a certain heaviness to his posture that suggested burdens carried for too long. He was still handsome in that polished, privileged way that had first attracted me, but something essential had diminished. The confident charm that had made him seem larger than life now looked like a performance he was tired of giving. "Claire," he finally said, my name sounding strange in his voice after so long. "I heard you were in the building. I thought maybe we should talk before we accidentally run into each other in some awkward situation." I gestured to the chair across from the small conference table where I was working, keeping my expression professionally neutral despite the way my heart had started racing. "Of course. Have a seat if you'd like." He entered hesitantly, closing the door behind him before sitting down. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 5 years of unspoken words and unresolved history. He looked at his hands, then at the window, anywhere but directly at me. Finally, he took a breath and met my eyes. "I didn't know it would be you," he started. "Dad said they were hiring Summit Innovations, but he never mentioned that you were the CEO. I guess I should have done my research, but I've been deliberately not keeping track of your life. It seemed easier that way." "Easier for whom?" I asked, my tone even but not unkind. "I'm here in a professional capacity, Marcus. Whatever happened between us is ancient history. It has no bearing on the work I'm doing with Hartley Industries." "Doesn't it though?" He leaned forward slightly, his expression troubled. "You're here to fix the mistakes my father made, to restructure a company that's failing because of decisions he prioritized over everything else, including our marriage. You can't tell me there isn't some satisfaction in that for you." I closed my laptop, giving him my full attention. Satisfaction isn't the right word. Vindication, maybe, in the sense that I've proven the judgments made about my capabilities were wrong. But I'm not here for revenge, Marcus. I'm here because your family business is struggling and my company has the expertise to help. 300 employees depend on Hartley Industries for their livelihoods. Whatever personal feelings exist between us, they matter far less than making sure those people keep their jobs. He nodded slowly, seeming to accept that. "You've done incredibly well. Summit Innovations has a stellar reputation. I've heard people talk about your leadership, about how you've built a company culture that prioritizes talent over politics. It's impressive." "Thank you," I said simply. Another long silence fell. Marcus fidgeted with his wedding ring, twisting it around his finger in a gesture I remembered from our marriage when he was nervous or uncertain. "Are you happy, Claire? In your life now, are you actually happy?" The question surprised me with its directness. I considered giving him a polite deflection but decided honesty served us both better. "I am. Not in the uncomplicated way I imagined happiness would be when I was younger, but in a deeper sense. I've built something meaningful through my own efforts. I work with people I respect who respect me in return. I make decisions based on what I think is right rather than what others expect of me. That's a kind of happiness that feels solid and real in ways I didn't understand 5 years ago." "I'm not," he said quietly. "Happy, I mean. The marriage to Vanessa was a mistake from the beginning. We both knew it, but we went through with it anyway because that's what Dad wanted, what the family expected. She's not a bad person, but we're not right for each other. We don't talk about anything real. We just exist in the same space, playing roles we're both tired of performing. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a confirmation of something I'd suspected. The life he'd chosen over our marriage hadn't brought him the happiness or success his father had promised. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Being trapped in an unhappy marriage is difficult. "Did you ever think about me?" He looked at me directly now, his eyes searching. "In the years since you left, did I cross your mind?" "Of course you did," I answered honestly. "You were my husband, Marcus. We had 3 years together that meant something, at least to me. When everything fell apart, I spent months analyzing every moment, wondering what I could have done differently, whether I'd somehow failed to be what you needed. But eventually I realized the failure wasn't mine. You made a choice, and I had to live with the consequences of that choice. So yes, I thought about you, but over time those thoughts became less painful and more just part of my history. I should have fought harder for us," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have told my father that his ultimatum was unacceptable, that I was choosing you regardless of the cost. But I was scared. Scared of losing the inheritance, of being cut off from everything I'd always assumed would be mine. I told myself I was being practical, that we could work something out later. I convinced myself you'd understand. But I didn't understand," I said quietly. "I understood that when the moment came to choose between me and money, you chose money. That taught me something important about where I stood in your priorities and about the kind of person I'd married. It hurt terribly at the time, but ultimately it freed me to become someone I'm much prouder of than the woman I was trying to be for your family. Do you think you could ever forgive me?" The question came out hesitant, almost pleading. Not to get back together or change anything about our current situations. Just to let go of whatever anger or resentment you might still carry. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway." I thought about that question carefully, examining my feelings with the same analytical approach I brought to business challenges. Was I still angry? Not really. Hurt? Only in the distant way old scars sometimes ache in cold weather. What I felt mostly was a kind of detached sympathy for the man sitting across from me. Someone who traded authentic connection for security and found the bargain far more costly than anticipated. "I forgave you a long time ago, Marcus. Not because you asked for it or earned it, but because carrying anger was exhausting and ultimately pointless. You made the choice that felt right to you at the time. I can disagree with that choice, can recognize the pain it caused, without maintaining active resentment. We're different people now, shaped by the paths we took after our marriage ended. I don't wish you unhappiness, but I also don't carry responsibility for the consequences of decisions you made." He nodded, looking both relieved and somehow sadder. "Thank you for that. And for treating this engagement professionally despite everything. A lot of people in your position would use this opportunity to make things difficult for my family." "Making things difficult for your family doesn't serve my purposes or my values," I said. "I'm here to do excellent work that helps a struggling company. If that work also happens to demonstrate that your father's judgments about my capabilities were wrong, that's just a side benefit. The main goal is organizational success, not personal vindication." Marcus stood slowly, preparing to leave. "I should let you get back to work. But Claire, one more thing. Seeing you like this, confident and successful and clearly thriving, it makes me realize what I gave up. Not just a wife, but a partner who could have been genuinely extraordinary if I'd had the courage to stand beside her instead of treating her as disposable. That's something I'll have to live with." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet office for a long time, processing the conversation that had just occurred. There'd been no dramatic confrontation, no angry accusations or tearful reconciliation. Just two people who'd once been married, acknowledging what had happened and finding a way to coexist professionally despite that history. It felt anticlimactic in some ways, but also right. The closure I'd thought I needed had arrived not through grand gestures but through simple, honest conversation. The following weeks in Portland developed a rhythm that became surprisingly comfortable. My days were filled with meetings, assessments, strategy sessions with department heads who were gradually warming to the changes we were implementing. Lucia proved invaluable, her ability to build rapport with skeptical employees making our work significantly easier. We identified quick wins that demonstrated value early, small operational changes that produced measurable improvements in efficiency and morale. Gregory and I maintained a professional distance, our interactions limited to necessary updates on implementation progress. He seemed genuinely committed to the restructuring process, though I could see the difficulty it caused him to acknowledge that his approach had been flawed. During one particularly contentious leadership meeting where we discussed eliminating positions that existed primarily to accommodate family members rather than serve business needs, he pushed back hard before finally conceding that sentiment couldn't override operational necessity. Diane reached out midway through the second month, inviting me to lunch at a restaurant I'd never been allowed to visit during my marriage because it was considered too casual for the Hartley family image. I almost declined, uncertain whether mixing personal and professional relationships was wise, but curiosity won out. She was already seated when I arrived, looking smaller somehow in the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the restaurant windows. She stood as I approached, offering a tentative smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss," I admitted as we both sat down. "If this is about the engagement, we should probably include other stakeholders in the conversation." "It's not about business," she said quickly. "At least not directly. Claire, I owe you an apology. A real one, not corporate politeness. I sat silent during that dinner 5 years ago when Gregory told you our marriage to Marcus was a mistake. I knew it was wrong, knew that what we were asking of you was unconscionable, but I didn't speak up. I chose my husband's wishes over basic human decency, and I've regretted that deeply." The apology caught me off guard in its directness. I'd expected corporate diplomacy or vague expressions of regret, not this straightforward acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because watching you work with our company, seeing the respect you command and the quality of leadership you provide, I'm confronted daily with the magnitude of the mistake we made," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You would have been an asset to our family, Claire. Not because of business connections or social standing, but because you're intelligent and principled and genuinely capable. We threw that away because Gregory was more concerned with appearances than substance. I enabled that decision through my silence, and I need you to know that I recognize how wrong that was." I took a sip of water, buying time to formulate my response. "Diane, I appreciate your honesty. That dinner was one of the worst nights of my life, and yes, your silence felt like betrayal. But I've also learned that people make choices based on complicated factors I may not fully understand. You were in a difficult position, and whatever reasons you had for not speaking up, they were yours to navigate. I can accept your apology without requiring a detailed accounting of why you made the choices you did." She reached across the table, stopping just short of touching my hand. "You're extraordinarily gracious. More gracious than I deserve. I want you to know that Marcus has been miserable. The marriage to your sister is a disaster. Vanessa is unhappy too, I think. She married Marcus thinking he'd provide security and status, but there's no genuine affection between them. They're two people trapped by the same family expectations that destroyed your marriage. That's unfortunate for both of them," I said carefully. "But it's also not something I can or should involve myself in. They made their choices just as I made mine. We all have to live with the outcomes." "Of course, you're right," Diane agreed. "I just thought you should know that the choice Gregory forced on Marcus didn't lead to the happy ending he promised. If anything, our family is more fractured now than it's ever been. Gregory and Marcus barely speak unless it's about business. Vanessa spends most of her time traveling, avoiding Portland altogether. The legacy my husband was so determined to protect is crumbling anyway, just through different mechanisms than he feared." We finished lunch talking about lighter topics, carefully avoiding the landmines of family drama and past hurts. As we parted ways outside the restaurant, Diane paused. "You know, I always liked you, Claire. Even when I didn't defend you, I recognized your quality. I hope that when this engagement is over, we might maintain some kind of cordial relationship." Not as family, obviously, but as people who survived difficult circumstances and came out wiser for it. I'd be open to that, I said, surprising myself with the sincerity of the statement. We're all just trying to navigate complicated situations as best we can. Holding grudges doesn't serve anyone. The final month of the intensive phase of our engagement was marked by visible improvements in Hartley Industries operations. Employee satisfaction scores had risen significantly as merit-based advancement policies were implemented and talented people finally received recognition for their contributions. Client retention showed marked improvement after we restructured account management to prioritize responsiveness and relationship building. The financial projections, while still challenging, suggested the company would return to profitability within 18 months rather than facing insolvency. Robert Chen invited me to present our final assessment to the full board, a formal conclusion to the intensive restructuring phase before we transitioned to ongoing advisory support. The presentation took place in the same conference room where I delivered the initial findings 3 months earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. The board members greeted me warmly, several expressing unsolicited appreciation for the work Summit Innovations had done. Even Gregory, sitting at the head of the table, looked more at peace than I'd seen him since my return to Portland. I walked them through every metric, every improvement, every challenge that remained. The data told a clear story of an organization rediscovering its footing after years of decline. More importantly, the cultural shifts we'd implemented were taking root. People throughout the company were beginning to believe that their contributions mattered more than their family connections, that innovation would be rewarded rather than suppressed. In conclusion, I said, wrapping up the presentation, Hartley Industries has tremendous potential for sustained success if it continues on this trajectory. The foundation we've built over the past 3 months is solid, but it requires ongoing commitment to the principles we've established. Prioritizing competence over convenience, embracing change rather than resisting it, and maintaining transparent communication at all organizational levels. These aren't one-time fixes but fundamental shifts in operational philosophy that must be sustained long-term. Robert Chen stood, beginning a round of applause that the other board members joined enthusiastically. Ms. Donovan, your work has exceeded every expectation. You've not only provided tactical solutions to immediate problems but helped us understand the deeper cultural issues that were threatening this company's survival. On behalf of the board, I want to express our profound gratitude. After the formal meeting concluded and most board members had departed, Gregory approached me near the windows where we'd stood months earlier during our first difficult conversation. He looked different now, less defensive and more genuinely humble. Claire, I need to say something before you leave Portland. What you've done for this company goes beyond consulting work. You've essentially saved my family's legacy while demonstrating principles I should have embraced decades ago. I was wrong about you, catastrophically wrong, and I'm deeply sorry for the pain my arrogance caused. The apology was more direct than I'd expected, devoid of the corporate language that usually softens such admissions. I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Hartley. It takes courage to acknowledge mistakes, especially ones made so publicly and with such conviction. I destroyed your marriage because I couldn't see past my own prejudices about background and social status, he continued. I prioritized superficial qualities over character and capability. That decision didn't just hurt you. It damaged my relationship with my son, created dysfunction in my family, and nearly destroyed the company I'd spent my life building. You had every right to refuse this engagement, to let us fail as natural consequences of my poor judgment. That you didn't, that you treated us fairly and did excellent work despite having every reason not to, says more about your character than I have words to express. I wasn't entirely altruistic, I admitted. Taking this engagement allowed me to demonstrate my value to people who dismissed me. There was definitely an element of wanting to prove you wrong. He smiled slightly, a sad but genuine expression. You accomplished that goal thoroughly. But you also saved jobs for 300 people who had nothing to do with past hurts. That speaks to priorities that extend beyond personal vindication. As I prepared to leave the building for the final time in this intensive phase, walking through hallways that had once felt so intimidating, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics had shifted. I was no longer the woman desperately seeking approval from people who deemed her inadequate. I was someone who'd built her own success through competence and determination, someone who'd faced her past with dignity and emerged even stronger. The flight back to Austin that evening felt different from all the previous trips between the two cities. This time I wasn't fleeing or proving anything. I was simply completing excellent work and returning to the life I'd built. Nina picked me up from the airport, immediately reading my expression and smiling. "It's done. You're finished with the intensive phase?" "Completely done," I confirmed. "They've got the tools and systems they need. Now it's just quarterly check-ins to ensure they're staying on track. The heavy lifting is finished." She pulled me into a quick hug before we headed toward her car. "I'm proud of you, you know. Not just for the professional success, though that's impressive. But for how you handled going back there, facing all those people and all that history. You could have been petty or vindictive, and no one would have blamed you. Instead you were professional and fair. That's real strength." Back in my Austin apartment that night, unpacking the last of my things from 3 months of regular Portland travel, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me full circle. 5 years ago I'd left this very city broken and uncertain, convinced that the failure of my marriage reflected fundamental inadequacy in who I was. I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece, discovering capabilities I hadn't known existed and refusing to accept other people's limitations as my own truth. The revenge I'd once fantasized about, making the Hartleys sorry for dismissing me, had proven far less satisfying than simply becoming someone whose value was undeniable. They'd needed me, had paid well for my expertise, and in the process had been forced to confront the flaws in thinking that had led to their crisis. But more importantly, I'd proven to myself that my worth wasn't determined by their judgment or anyone else's opinion. It was inherent, measurable through my contributions and confirmed through the respect of people whose opinions I valued. My phone buzzed with a message from Thomas asking how the final presentation had gone. I smiled and typed back a brief update, grateful for his mentorship and the opportunities he'd provided. Summit Innovations had given me a platform to demonstrate what I was capable of, but the foundation was built through my own determination to never again accept being made small by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. The weeks following my return to Austin full-time brought a sense of peace I'd been missing during the intensive Portland engagement. I threw myself back into running Summit Innovations, taking on new clients and expanding our team to handle growing demand. The success with Hartley Industries had generated significant publicity, and other family-operated businesses facing similar challenges began reaching out for consultations. 6 months after completing the intensive phase, I received an unexpected package at my office. Inside was a leather-bound book, clearly expensive, with a handwritten note from Gregory tucked inside. "Claire, I wanted you to have this. It's a history of Hartley Industries written by my father 20 years ago. He believed strongly in documenting lessons learned so future generations could benefit from past wisdom. I'm hoping you'll accept this as a symbol of gratitude and as an acknowledgement that your insights have now become part of our company's legacy. You helped save something that matters deeply to our family, and that gift deserves recognition beyond just financial compensation. With deep respect and appreciation, Gregory Hartley." I sat with that book for a long time, paging through decades of business history, family photographs, and reflections on building and sustaining an enterprise across generations. The final pages were blank, clearly meant for future entries documenting continued evolution. It struck me that Gregory was essentially inviting me to be part of that ongoing story, to have my contribution recognized as foundational to the company's survival and future success. That evening, I drafted a response, choosing my words carefully to convey appreciation without suggesting any relationship beyond professional respect. "Mr. Hartley, thank you for this thoughtful gift. The history of Hartley Industries is impressive, and I'm honored to have played a role in ensuring that story continues. I wish you and your family all success as you build on the foundations we established together." The blank pages at the end represent possibility and potential. I hope you'll fill them with achievements that reflect the principles of merit, adaptability, and authentic value that we worked so hard to implement. With professional regards, Claire Donovan. The years that followed brought continued growth for Summit Innovations and gradual healing of old wounds I hadn't realized still existed. I heard through professional networks that Hartley Industries had indeed sustained the improvements we'd implemented, that the company had returned to profitability and was thriving under restructured leadership. I also heard, though this came through less formal channels, that Marcus had eventually divorced Vanessa and left the family business entirely to pursue work that aligned with his actual interests rather than family expectations. I felt no triumph at hearing about his divorce, just a kind of melancholy acknowledgement that the life Gregory had orchestrated for his son had ultimately made no one happy. Marcus had sacrificed our marriage for an inheritance and legacy that he eventually chose to walk away from anyway. The irony was profound, the waste of years and potential relationships almost tragic. On the 5th anniversary of founding Summit Innovations, my team threw a surprise party in our downtown Austin offices. The space had grown dramatically from our humble beginnings, now occupying 3 floors with over 60 employees and satellite offices in 4 cities. As I stood looking around at the people who'd chosen to build this company with me, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Thomas, who'd formally retired 2 years earlier but still kept close tabs on the company he'd helped me launch, raised his glass for a toast. To Claire Donovan, who took what could have been a devastating personal setback and transformed it into the foundation for remarkable professional achievement. You've built something special here, kid. Not just a successful company, but a culture where people are valued for their contributions and challenged to exceed their own expectations. That's a legacy worth celebrating. Later that evening, after most people had left and the office was quiet, Nina found me standing by the windows looking out over Austin's skyline. "You're thinking about Portland," she said, not a question but a statement. "Just reflecting on how far I've come," I admitted. 5 years ago I stood in a hotel room in this city with nothing but a suitcase and shattered confidence. I had no idea what would come next or whether I'd ever feel whole again. Now look at this. I gestured to the office around us, the physical manifestation of years of hard work and determination. "You did this," Nina said firmly. "Not in spite of what happened in Portland, but because of what you chose to do with it. They tried to make you small, and you responded by building something bigger than they could imagine. That's not revenge, Claire. That's transformation." Her words resonated deeply. The woman who'd fled Portland in tears and confusion had been transformed through adversity into someone far stronger and more capable. The Hartleys had tried to diminish me, and in doing so had inadvertently freed me to discover my actual potential. Their judgment had been wrong, their values misguided, but their rejection had been the catalyst for becoming someone I was genuinely proud to be. As I drove home that night through Austin streets that now felt completely familiar, I thought about the concept of revenge and vindication. I'd gotten both in ways I'd never anticipated, not through deliberately harming the people who'd hurt me but through simply living well and building something meaningful. The best response to being underestimated wasn't anger or retaliation. It was excellence, sustained and undeniable, that made the original misjudgment impossible to overlook. Gregory Hartley had told me I wasn't sophisticated enough to represent his family's interests. I'd responded by becoming a CEO who saved his company. Marcus had chosen inheritance over our marriage. I'd responded by building a legacy entirely my own that no one could take away. Vanessa had betrayed me by pursuing my husband. I'd responded by creating a life so fulfilling that her actions became irrelevant to my happiness. None of this had been planned or calculated. I hadn't set out to prove anyone wrong or make them sorry. I'd simply refused to accept their assessment of my value as truth. I'd worked hard, taken risks, and built something that reflected my capabilities rather than their limitations. The vindication that followed was natural consequence rather than intentional goal, which made it somehow sweeter and more meaningful. Years later, long after the immediate drama had faded into distant memory, I received one final communication from the Hartley family. It was a wedding invitation, elegant and formal, announcing the marriage of Marcus Hartley to someone I'd never heard of. Included was a personal note in Marcus's handwriting asking if I might attend, acknowledging that it was an unusual request but expressing hope that enough time had passed for us to celebrate life's milestones without the weight of past pain. I studied that invitation for a long time, considering what my attendance would mean. It would be a final declaration that the past truly was behind us, that forgiveness had evolved into something approaching genuine indifference. I RSVP'd yes, curious to see who this new woman was and whether Marcus had finally found the happiness that had eluded him in the marriage he'd chosen over ours. The wedding took place at a small vineyard outside Portland, intimate and lovely in ways his wedding to Vanessa had not been. Marcus looked genuinely happy for the first time since I'd known him, relaxed in a way I'd never witnessed during our marriage. His new wife was a teacher, unpretentious and warm, with none of the social ambitions that had characterized Vanessa. She had no connection to the Hartley business empire and apparently no interest in acquiring one. She loved Marcus for who he was rather than what he represented, which seemed to free him to finally be authentic. Gregory and Diane were there, older but somehow softer than I remembered. Gregory approached me during the reception, his movements careful as if uncertain of his welcome. "Claire, thank you for coming. It means more than you probably realize. Marcus was adamant that we invite you, that he wanted to show you he'd finally learned what actually matters in building a life." "I'm glad he's found happiness," I said sincerely. "Everyone deserves that, regardless of past mistakes." He nodded slowly, then surprised me by adding something personal. "I learned from you, you know. From watching how you handled our engagement with Summit Innovations, how you treated us fairly despite having every reason not to. You demonstrated principles I should have valued all along. That lesson came at tremendous cost to you, and I'll always regret that. But I want you to know the lesson wasn't wasted." As I drove back to the airport later that evening, I reflected on the strange closure that wedding had provided. All the key players in the drama that had once consumed my life were moving forward, building new chapters that bore little resemblance to the disaster 5 years earlier. Marcus had found love based on authenticity rather than expectation. Gregory had learned to value substance over appearance, though the lesson had nearly cost him everything. And I had built a life so rich and fulfilling that attending my ex-husband's wedding felt less like painful obligation and more like celebrating a friend's happiness. The plane lifted off from Portland for what I suspected would be the last time for a long while. I had no reason to return to this city anymore, no business or personal obligations tying me to these streets where I'd once felt so lost and inadequate. Austin was home now, fully and completely, the place where I discovered who I actually was beneath the layers of other people's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from Nina as we reached cruising altitude. "How was the wedding? Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I typed back. "I'm free. Completely, finally free." And I was. Free from the weight of old hurts, from the need to prove anything to anyone, from the lingering question of whether I'd made the right choice in walking away 5 years ago. The life I'd built since leaving Portland had answered every doubt, resolved every question, and demonstrated beyond any possibility of argument that my value had never been dependent on the Hartley family's approval. I'd always been enough, exactly as I was. It had just taken losing everything to discover that truth. Summit Innovations continued to thrive, my leadership team expanded, and new opportunities emerged that I'd never have imagined during those dark early days in Austin. But more than professional success, I'd gained something far more valuable. The unshakable knowledge that I could face devastation and emerge stronger, that other people's judgments about my worth were irrelevant compared to my own understanding of my capabilities, and that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the freedom that comes from their rejection. The Hartleys had tried to diminish me, and in doing so had freed me to become someone far more impressive than I'd ever have been as Marcus's wife. That was the real revenge, if it could even be called that. Not making them sorry, but making myself extraordinary. Not proving them wrong through argument, but demonstrating my value through achievement so undeniable it required no defense. As the plane descended into Austin, the city lights spreading below like possibilities waiting to be seized, I smiled at my reflection in the window. The woman looking back was confident, accomplished, and most importantly, completely at peace with who she'd become. She'd taken the worst moment of her life and transformed it into the foundation for something remarkable. She'd refused to be defined by other people's limitations and had built a legacy entirely her own. That woman was someone worth being, someone I was proud to have become. And that was better than any revenge I could have possibly planned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.